don't mind, folks, I'm going to go to the screen because I have some images I want to show, and maybe if we have time, a couple of videos. And hope that our technology is going to work. Look at that. What I have here is about a 3-hour slideshow that I've been working on for my journalism ethics program. I teach journalism ethics in the School of Journalism and Mass Media. And the issues involved with media in Ferguson are so deep and so complicated that they really deserve semester-long, at minimum, attention. In fact, journalism schools all over the country are developing semester, quarter-long courses devoted to Ferguson. So boiling this down to 5 or 10 minutes means I'm going to give you less than an inch deep and about a yard long on something that is incredibly complex. And during the Q&A, if there are areas that you want me to expound on at a little bit greater length, I'm happy to do that. But I did want to be able to show you some images, because we can't talk about media coverage without looking at the coverage itself. And I've divided this up into 3 areas. Yes, there are some good things that we can talk about in terms of media coverage out of Ferguson. There's a lot of bad things. I'm going to talk about that. And then I did want to highlight a couple of professional practice issues that I think are worth talking about and reflect some of the things I try to talk about in my classes. First off, the good is bearing witness. That's one of the fundamental roles of journalism. We bear witness to the events in the world. And in bearing witness, we bring to the attention of people things they might not know or understand or need to know. I'm struck, my epiphanous moment when I was young, way young, was watching the dogs in Little Rock and the fire hoses attacking civil rights protesters. It was broadcast on national network TV, and I was sitting there watching with my parents, and my mother is sobbing. You know, how could this happen in America? Bearing witness to what was happening in the South in the 50s and 60s helped fuel one element of the civil rights movement. So bearing witness to what's occurred in Ferguson is really important. This is Scott Olson of Getty Images, probably one of the great photographers of our day, working in Ferguson. He ends up in August, after the first round of protests, doing 2 covers. This is Bloomberg Business Week. That's a fabulous shot. And then this is his Tragedy of Ferguson cover for Time. Scott Olson is among about 25 journalists who were arrested trying to do their jobs, hauled off to jail for getting in the way of the police. One of the prices that we pay in bearing witness sometimes is to put ourselves at risk. This is a great image. This is a citizen journalist. This is not somebody from the legacy media. She doesn't work for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. This is a rally in St. Louis by the Arch, a little bit after the first round of protests. I think it's just a fabulous image that bears witness to another aspect of what's happening in Ferguson. I'm not going to play this video, it takes too much time, but here's a situation where CNN reporters are trying to describe police activity. They're trying to describe what Reverend Stevens was talking about, the equipment, the tanks, the gas. And in the process of reporting it, they themselves are tear gassed and forced to flee and roughed up by the police. So bearing witness sometimes comes at a cost. Another positive is creating the conversation. There's an old maxim in civic or public journalism that one of the media's responsibilities, the responsibility of the press, is to create the conversation that should be happening in a community and isn't happening. Well, conversation about race is the conversation we should be having all over the country, should have been having for the last 150 years, and generally avoid. And there are some elements of the media that have been trying to generate that conversation. This is a screen grab. That signboard is flash, and the messages change every few seconds. I just grabbed the screen grab on this, but this is a project sponsored by a half a dozen different journalism organizations: The Guardian, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the African American paper in the St. Louis area, a couple of other organizations, and the goal here is to generate a thoughtful conversation about race issues that grow out of Ferguson. It's one of a number of efforts to generate a meaningful conversation. The efforts are sincere. Their success is varied, and this is one reason why. St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which set up a specific system for generating in print an interactive conversation on race, was forced to turn off its comments section because the comments had become so vile, so racist, so full of vitriol, that any effort to be reasonable or thoughtful was lost. So they've turned it off, and by losing that interactivity, the conversation itself is diminished. It's one of the realities of trying to generate this conversation through media intervention. And then I wanted to show you this picture. It has nothing to do, well, it has everything to do with Ferguson, but it's not out of Ferguson. Some of you may have seen this out of Portland, Oregon, a couple of weeks ago. A protest following the Garner decision, so it's in relation to the verdict in Long Island, or the decision in Long Island. And there's a community protest. This is a young African-American fellow. He's 12 years old. He was very emotional. He's carrying a sign talking about his future as a young African-American in our society, his fear for his life. He's got tears streaming down his face. He's carrying a sign that says "Free Hugs." And a police officer on security duty for the Portland Police Department hugs him. And this went viral. Millions and millions of hits on this, on Facebook, Twitter, just about any place you look. Made all the network shows. As an editor of a newspaper, which I have been more often than not, I'd use that photo. But take a look, if you can, just very quickly, the comment on the side from Jonathan Jones of The Guardian, who says it's a blatant lie. You know, who argues that this image essentially whitewashes the issues that are really at play in Ferguson and Long Island and other communities around the country. He's not right and he's not wrong, but it's a point of view that I think shows how difficult and complex this conversation is and must be. You know, nothing simple about any of this. I thought that was a feel-good photo too, and it was a bit of a wake-up for me to begin to try and put myself on the other side of that photo. Again, I'm not going to play the video here, but one of the other good things, new journalists, people we've never heard of before, particularly young and particularly diverse. Talk about lack of diversity in the media in a minute. This is Mariah Stewart. She's 23. She had just graduated from journalism school in the East. Ferguson happens. She has a friend in St. Louis. She's called to St. Louis to do journalism. She has no employer, no job, but she feels she needs to be there to cover these events. And after a week of citizen journalism, she's picked up by an alternative publication. And within a few weeks, the Huffington Post, which, by the way, is the most accessed online-only news site in the United States, the Huffington Post does a crowdfunding, raises $40,000, and hires her as the Ferguson Fellow. She will spend the next year doing journalism for the Huffington Post, covering nothing but Ferguson, living in Ferguson. Terrific young journalist. I'm going to play just a few seconds of this video, just so you can see who I'm talking about. This is Tim Pool. And do I not have a mouse? Yes, I've got a mouse. This is Tim Pool. And we don't have audio, but you see who he is. That's okay. Tim Pool is 20-something. He started out as a citizen journalist, called to journalism without any employer. He's a backpack journalist. He carries everything in a backpack. He does video, multimedia. He embeds himself inside events. He got his start covering the Occupy movement. He's a viral sensation. He has his own YouTube channel. He supports himself through crowdfunding. But his ability to get inside a story is so substantial that Fusion, which is a joint operation of ABC and Univision, aimed at young Americans, English and Spanish speaking. Univision hired him for Ferguson, and he can go where nobody else can go, live report. He is the model for countless journalists in the United States who see what he does as a model for their own careers. Okay, those are the good things. There's some more, but we're going to talk about some of the bad. Parachute journalism. My students hear me talk about this all the time. Part of the problem covering major news stories in the US or anywhere else right now is that our journalistic capacity is down by 1/3 to 1/2 in just the last 10 years. We've lost that number of reporters by percentage. So when you lose 1/3 to 1/2 of all journalists in America, that means stuff doesn't get covered. Bureaus no longer exist. The major news organizations don't have people sitting in St. Louis in bureaus like they did just a few years ago. So when big news happens, they put their reporters on a plane and drop them into the place where the news is happening. That's why we call it parachute journalism. And they come and they do their jobs and they report stories, and the stories are factual, they're accurate, but they lack all authenticity. They have no connection to the history, the culture, the politics, the sociology of a community. We call them parachute journalists, and these two photos perfectly capture it. These are three national reporters on the left working out of a McDonald's in Ferguson. A number of reporters used this McDonald's because it had Wi-Fi and cheap food as their headquarters. They were also arrested frequently by the police as they walked outside the doors. The other is a picture of the Washington Post's newsroom in Ferguson. It's at the Marriott Airport Hotel. Has there ever been a better metaphor for parachute journalism? Again, the facts are right, but they're not necessarily the right facts, and they're losing the authenticity. What we tell our students is your journalism has to reflect the life of your communities and all of its wholeness and complexity, and these people don't have a clue, bless their hearts. You know, they're trying to do their jobs, but they can never be authentic. Lack of journalistic diversity, huge issue, especially in a place like Ferguson. The local media are almost entirely white, particularly local television. St. Louis Post-Dispatch has a fair, diverse staff, but it has been racked by layoffs and downsizing. They have many fewer journalists than they used to have. It took time for them to mobilize, and particularly to get their people in place. The national networks, diversity of a sort, in a TV sort of way, cable networks included. So that what does this lack of diversity do? The best argument for diversity is what I just talked about. Understanding the community and all of its wholeness and complexity. How can you understand white privilege and the divisions between white and black in a community related to police relations if you've never lived them? You can understand it intellectually, you can never understand it authentically. You have to have journalists of color. And it has taken months, frankly, for that to happen. Opining bias. When we talk about media action, especially in a place like Ferguson, there is a tendency to look at cable news and call that media and say the media screwed up. Well, cable news has screwed up big time in Ferguson, in Long Island, in Berkeley, in Portland, just about any place that they've covered it. And part of the problem is their inability to separate their journalism function from their opinion function. This is just an example. This is Don Lemon, who has really sparked outrage in the minority audience for CNN, the African American audience, because he has taken kind of a conservative tack. And he is literally arguing nose to nose, toe to toe, neither party listening to the other, with a local rapper, hip hop star, who's trying to explain to him why the black community is outraged at what has happened. In a sense, it's kind of like the debate that Reverend Stevens talked about a second ago. Don Lemon's trying to argue the facts, and the hip-hop artist, he's trying to explain what's happening. And they're just not connecting. And his refusal to back away and let the facts speak for themselves have caused CNN enormous trouble. Of course, you also have Fox. I am going to play a bit of this video. Oh, we can't hear it. That's right. Okay, this is a Fox reporter. He's covering one of the protests from just before Thanksgiving. He's not focusing on the cause. He's not focusing on the debate. He's not focusing on police violence. What he's doing a report on is he's found a stash of vodka and soda pop mixer, which he is suggesting has fueled looters and criminals in Ferguson. For his trouble, he gets hit with a rock and knocked unconscious at the end of the report. I'm certainly not advocating that, but Fox has not made any pretense about trying to get to the basis of the divide. Their conversation's never been about racial issues. It's been about the false narratives of black-on-black crime and a variety of others. On the other side, causing nearly as much disruption in the journalistic community, I've got a problem with this. Al Sharpton, who is a commentator for MSNBC, is also an activist. Traditional journalistic ethics say you don't involve him in the news coverage. Here he's playing his activist role. A few hours later he's on TV as a journalistic commentator. Those roles are mutually exclusive in a situation like this. So I consider that to be part of the opining and bias problem. And one of the downsides of all of this, when the media, and particularly in this case, the dominant cable news media, lose our trust, lose the trust of white Americans, lose the trust of black Americans, lose the trust of law enforcement, lose the trust of the political constituency. When you lose trust and you lose credibility, who's left to create the dialogue? Who's left to provide the common language that allows us to debate these issues intelligently? And this is CNN reaping Don Lemon's politics and opinion. 24/7 cable news, the prosecutor is not wrong here. Regardless of the decision made about the grand jury, he's saying that his job was made more difficult by the media, and particularly that part of the media that we call citizen journalists or social media, which made his job more complicated, and that could not be more true. Millions and millions of social media messages moving over the lines within minutes of any given event, taken as fact by vast numbers of Americans, create false impressions. Try as we might, those of us who have a greater association with legacy media can never catch up to this. And that's what made his problem more difficult. People are coming to him from all sides of the problem, asserting facts that are simply untrue. That makes life difficult for all of us. Inciting violence. This is the New York Daily News after the Garner decision, killer cop goes free. Something happened in this case, though. This is not an unusual front page, particularly for the tabloid media. But in this case, somebody at the New York Daily News sent this out on Twitter before it was actually published. The reaction on social media was so immediate that the New York Daily News changed their front page. But the thinking behind it is all too typical. Issues of professional practice. Framing the story. How do you frame a story? Most powerful decision a journalist makes is how to frame the story, the frame of reference. This is why a diverse news staff is so important. Imagery is a huge part of framing, and so you have competing images. We have the same significant problem with Trayvon Martin case. On the one hand, you've got Michael Brown, the high school graduate, and social media provides a wealth of imagery of Michael Brown, the 16, 17, 18-year-old high school student, successful, graduating from school, aspirations, etc. Social media also, and you can find the same on the Facebook pages of our own students, there are a number of pictures of him doing the gangsta thing, flashing some signs and looking all tough. Which picture you choose says something about the point of view you're bringing to the story. And then we have the surveillance video of somebody, it's still not entirely certain who that is. It might be Michael Brown. There are some who argue it's not. Committing a robbery in a little Zip Trip type store just before the shooting. And if that's your lead photo, as it was on KCTV in St. Louis, that says something about your perspective and your point of view. That's what we call story framing. Framing the story. These are the St. Louis Post-Dispatch front pages, one from August and one from November. Notice the choice of lead photos. Now, I have to tell you, in looking at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch over time, I think they've done generally a respectful job of trying to achieve balance between peaceful and violent. I'm not sure that these pages do that. Maybe defensively on the first day you could argue that the lead photos are of the violence, but this is a story framing issue. But take a look at this. This is the Philadelphia Daily News. Tabloid, respectable, good tabloid in Philadelphia. Serves inner city Philadelphia. It's not a suburban paper. Large African American audience. And this image on the left is their first edition from this particular night in August. This is their first edition. Hell breaks loose, rioting, protester throwing a Molotov cocktail. Pretty much the same presentation for the second edition, but a different photo. That is a stark representation of what I mean by story framing. Those two pages basically developed out of the same set of facts at pretty much the same time, in the same location, tell completely different stories. Which one's the more valid story? I'm not going to tell you one way or the other, but what I want to say is that is an example of the power of story framing. and why you need to bring to the decision-making table when you're in the media a certain level of sophistication and critical thinking before you step into these waters. One of the other professional issues that I think is a positive, in general, cable news has failed. Sensation, violence, visuals, 24/7 coverage, driving high ratings. In general, the print folks have not done so badly. You've got more time, you've got more space, you've got more nuance, and you've got visibility. So here we have Pundit Fact, which is a cousin to PolitiFact, Pulitzer Prize winning political fact-checking site. And this particular piece, which takes up a whole lot more than one screen, fact-checks 10 claims made by media pundits about black life in America and debunks what the TV commentators, mostly from Fox, are saying about black America. That's a good thing. And that's it for now. If you have other questions, we can sure talk about later, and I appreciate you letting me do it from up here.
We'll have questions at the end.